Thank you very much for that kind introduction. It's a privilege to be allowed to attend this panel. I hope we can at least establish a few facts and ideas about the Brexit vote, although we'll have to restrain ourselves to some headlines rather than going in depth on all issues. I think I'll start by a quote. And please allow me to read from the screen, because that screen is a little too small for me. If you're born poor, you'll die on average 9 years earlier than others. If you're black, you're treated more harshly by the criminal justice system. If you're a white working class boy, you're less likely than anyone else in Britain to go to university. If you're at a state school, you're less likely to reach the top professions than if you're educated privately. If you're a woman, you'll earn less than a man. If you suffer from mental health problems, there's not enough help to hand. If you're young, you'll find it harder than ever before to own your own home. I know you're working around the clock. I know you're doing your best. And I know that sometimes life can be a struggle. The government I lead will be driven not by the interests of the privileged few, but by yours. Now, whose words are these? Could this be Clement Attlee of 1945? Harold Wilson, 1964, perhaps? Any Labour Party leader to choose from? No, these are the words of Theresa May on the steps of Downing Street last summer when she entered the post as Prime Minister. Now, what is this all about? How should we interpret Theresa May's appeal to not only to the centre ground, but quite distinctly to the working class or to the struggling classes of Britain? It's not the commonplace ideas from a Conservative Prime Minister, but it's certainly part of the mandate she has given herself in the wake of the Brexit vote. The kind of social grievances that she would like to redress in order to bring people on board and to sort of to halt the wave of populism that has characterized Britain through the Brexit referendum. Last year could be seen, at least in some ways, as the year that liberal internationalism was rejected, not only in Britain but also across the Atlantic with the presidential election. Britain is particularly interesting in this regard, at the forefront of globalization, in the sense of cross-border movement of goods, people, capital, and so on since the 1980s. This has been coupled with a deregulated labour market and increasing social liberalism, in the sense that you could live as you like to a larger extent than before, including greater respect for minorities, for different lifestyles, issues that we would tend to see as progressive. But then we're part of the liberal elite of the big cities, aren't we? Not everyone shares the attractions of social liberalism. There's certainly an undercurrent of conservative law and order, family values under the Brexit vote as well, which we'll look into a bit later. Brexit, the majority that voted to leave the European Union, could be considered protest against at least some of these forces, certainly the first two. And we will try to establish why this is so and how the current government is seeking to sort of address and perhaps redress those problems. A couple of background issues, first of all. In terms of social inequality, Britain has seen a rather large increase during the 1980s, followed by relative stability since then, across shifting governments. It is a full-fledged fact that the Britain of today is in a different place than the Britain in the 1970s as far as social inequality goes. I'm sure this is a well-established fact amongst the audience. This has in recent years been combined with a rise in migration, immigration more specifically. David Cameron, when becoming Prime Minister in 2010, referred to as one of his aims to bring net migration down to the tens of thousands, that is below 100,000 people a year. Currently, net migration in Britain is close to 300,000. So you'll have around 600,000 people leaving Britain every year. 300,000 people leaving Britain every year and 600,000 coming in. That is a net migration of almost 300,000. This, of course, includes all the European migrants as well. And that aspect of immigration is something you can do little about as long as you're part of the European Union. As long as you're a full-fledged member state and part of the internal market, you cannot really halt that immigration. And that has been one of the key drivers behind the rise of Euroscepticism in Britain. There is reason to ask what that rise in Euroscepticism was grounded in. And I think it's right to refer to Tory Euroscepticism. That is the Euroscepticism of the right in Britain. If we look at how the process unfolded before the vote, why the referendum was launched, it was to a large extent an internal debate on the right wing of British politics. That is within the Conservative Party as well as amongst the UK Independence Party voters and politicians. In the Conservative Party, there was the classic Euroscepticism based on the belief that legitimate authority resides in the UK Parliament only, and also the belief that the EU is a sort of an inefficient way of organizing international trade. It's a waste of resources, it's responsible for unnecessary regulation and so on. The point about unnecessary regulation is something that is distinct in British Euroscepticism in contrast with what we know in Norway or Scandinavia. When David Cameron launched the idea of a referendum, he referred to as one of his problems with the EU was the fact that European regulations would hinder doctors at UK hospitals working longer hours, ever longer hours. So it was the Working Time Directive that he was directly against in that regard. So whatever approach Fafo may have to the EU, attacking that directive might not be on the agenda, I should think, because it's an attempt to civilize the labour market. But precisely that idea is something that free marketeers on the British right would attack. So a democratic deficit and the inefficiency of the EU would be the sort of classic Euroscepticism within the Tory party. In recent years, there's been elements added to this that has helped cause the referendum itself. The sense of crisis through the economic crisis in the Eurozone, as well as the refugee crisis in recent years. Those developments have created a notion in Britain that not only is the EU inefficient, it's become a dangerous place, a dangerous entanglement. We'd better liberate ourselves from the sort of the problems of the continent. We need to get out of here, basically. That has been a key argument. And then, of course, the immigration numbers and the belief that in order to control our borders, to regain control of our borders, it is necessary to leave the European Union. Now, moving from that sort of prelude to the referendum to the result itself, there are a few observations that could easily be made. This is a map of the Remain majority and Leave majority across Britain. And I'm sure as a sort of visual entry to this discussion, it's fairly clear-cut. There are some yellow areas here where the majority opted for Remain, and the blue areas where the majority voted Leave on the 23rd of June. And I'm sure you're aware of the situation in Scotland, as well as in London, and also in Northern Ireland, key areas where a majority wanted to remain within the European Union. Now, if we break down these crude colours into regional numbers, we find that the highest Leave vote would be in areas not traditionally characterized by Euroscepticism. These are not the well-off sort of right-wing patriots that have opted to leave the European Union. These are rather the sort of the people in the post-industrial backyard of Britain, Northern England, Northeast, as well as the Midlands and Yorkshire, areas where the safe jobs of the industrial era have been replaced by poorly paid service sector jobs, if any jobs at all, in the modern international economy. And those voters in those areas were the ones most vocally against EU membership, those who wanted to leave the European Union. You'll find the same pattern if you look at social characteristics. These are a bit technical, the different categories, but if you look on the left-hand side there by the star, you'll see that education, in the sense of higher education or the absence of such, is one of the key indicators, key explanations at the level of voters why you would opt for remain or leave. And age as well goes into that pattern. And you'll find that the stereotypical Leave voter would be one living in a non-urban area. Surprisingly often, this would be either in the Midlands or in the north of England. These voters would also typically or stereotypically be white British, of relatively low education and high age, that is at least 50 years old or more. And with a party affiliation at the last election towards Conservatives or UKIP. Amongst these Leave voters, there would be a lot of traditional working class voters who have now left behind the Labour Party and their belief in the left as such, and have opted for a sort of, we do not approve of political elites, we do not approve of where the country is heading. We might support Conservatives or UKIP, and we're certainly voting to leave the European Union. Against these groups, you would find the stereotypical Remain voter, who would be people such as us, such as the majority of us, I should think, living in urban areas of mixed ethnicity, or at least living in a mixed ethnic environment, relatively highly educated, often young age or low age, and a party affiliation towards the Labour Party, Liberal Democrats, Greens, or in the Scottish case, the SNP. One of the interesting observations going beyond those social characteristics is the urban-rural divide that we have referred to. In London, this is taken to the extreme. You'll find that in the city itself, the Remain majority was very, very high compared with most of Britain and certainly most of England. And that even included relatively poor inner city areas, such as Lambeth, for example. 78.6% Remain at the referendum. That contrasts strongly with some of the suburban areas. To some extent, well-off areas towards the south and the west, but to the strongest degree towards the east, where relatively poor housing estates, white ethnic dominance, and so on, are characteristics. You can see the same pattern if you continue from London into the Thames Estuary. You'll find that the darker blue, the higher the Leave majority in that area. And it's like you've drawn a border between London itself and the areas outside of London, going east. And many of these areas, although they're not part of the north of England, they suffer from many of the same problems. Jobs that have been lost, job security that has been lost, certainly. A rise in immigration at the same time as people have seen decreasing wages, if wages at all. Different challenges in terms of the stable neighborhoods and all that you would like to the kind of stability that was there in previous decades, at least according to the mythology about the honourable past that people seek back towards. Now, if these are the signals from the voters, how could it be cured? And could Brexit be of help of curing those ills that Brexit seems to be a symptom of? Now, leaving the EU will hardly change those economic structures that characterize post-industrial Britain. Britain will still be part of a sort of globalized economy. Britain, and as long as the City of London survives, it will also be a society with an unhealthy reliance on financial services and consumer debt, It will be an economy with an oversized service sector with low-skilled, low-paid jobs, unless something revolutionary comes out of Theresa May's government. And it will be an economy with a deregulated labor market, where the kind of race to the bottom that we've seen since in the last decade, since East European migrants started coming in, that is likely to continue, with or without the presence of East European workers. Now, with half a minute left, I think I'll just mention finally that there is an overarching dilemma in all this, at least if you're on the political right wing where the referendum originated. A desire to minimize migration, minimize the influence of the EU, minimize budget contributions towards Europe, but make an economic success of it nevertheless. You'd better have good friends in Europe if you want to achieve those aims concurrently. Thanks very much indeed. Thank you.